Hello, everyone. Today we're going to do a story. Anyway, some people claim that Sam Birchfield got away with murder. He lived in the mountains. He was the greatest mountain man that ever lived. Some call him that. But anyway, prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Samuel Birchfield. But anyway, I hope y'all doing great. I hope y'all enjoy these stories. I love telling them. Anyway, here we go. 1840, Carter County, Tennessee, near where I live, actually. Our story begins in the deep winter of 1840 in the long blue shadow of Rand Mountain in Carter County, Tennessee. It's here that a boy named Sam Birchfield was born in a one-room cabin that had been built by his grandfather just 2 generations before in a remote area known as Tiger Valley, an untamed wilderness that was teeming with every imaginable wild animal. In fact, the valley had once been the hunting grounds of the Cherokee just a decade before. Young Sam grew up as much of a creature of this valley as the animals he hunted in the summers. His feet grew as tough as leather from running across the rocky creek bottoms, and in the winter he was never without his skin cap, and he set his rabbit snares along the old trails that had been carved by the Indians. And although Sam was innocent of all book learning, he was highly educated by the mountains that taught him a different kind of literacy. He could read the forest in a way other boys read a primer. A bent blade of grass told him which way a deer had passed. He knew when rain was coming by the smell of the air, and when there would be a frost by the stillness of the birds. And by the time most boys were still clinging to their mother's apron, Sam was slipping through Tiger Valley alone. Indeed, the mountains were his classroom, and the animals were his teacher. By all accounts, the Birchfield family were cut from the same cloth as America's first self-sufficient pioneers. Theirs was a life of total independence that was built with strong backs and skilled hands. They were gunsmiths, coopers, weavers, and tanners. Sam's father could forge a gun barrel from a wagon spring and carve his stock from a maple tree. That's right. If they couldn't craft it themselves, they did without. Since the nearest store was a hard day's ride away over the mountains, not that they ever had much need for store-bought things, they grew all their own food on the steep hillsides and kept a few milk cows and a team of oxen. And of course, they made all their own liquor, which served as their medicine and their currency as well. Known that the Birchfields had long-standing reputation for producing some of the purest, most potent Who Shot John in the county. Sam's grandfather was a master distiller who passed on the closely guarded family recipe down to his son, and by the time Sam was tall enough to stand on a stump and look over the top of the copper steel, his pa had passed the sacred knowledge to him. And so, you see, for the first 2 decades of his life, Sam lived in a state of wild grace, completely free of the paradise of Tiger Valley. But during the 1860s, the long arm of a nation that was tearing itself apart began to reach into even the deepest coves, and eventually the drums of war that had swept across America came to Tiger Valley. Then by 1862, just as Sam had taken a new bride, it was duty to country, or perhaps the pull of adventure that came calling, and Sam, well, he would answer. He enlisted in the 59th Regiment of the Tennessee Confederate Mounted Infantry. For the next 2 years, the mountaineer turned soldier served in the gritty, brutal struggle for the control of the Cumberland Gap, which was a vital supply line that separated Kentucky and Tennessee. But it didn't take long for Sam to realize that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And it wasn't nearly as glorious as those politicians that had promised it would be. and after 2 years of nearly starving on dwindling rations of salt pork and cornbread, Sam Birchfield was finally mustered out of service in 1864, where he walked to Tiger Valley. Yet, when Sam returned home, he found that it wasn't the paradise that he left. Like so many families across the South, the Civil War had broken the Birchfield's way of life. The valley had been terrorized by bushwhackers from both sides who used their war as an excuse for robbing and plundering. Several times they had descended on the homestead, looting the smokehouse, driving off the livestock, and stealing everything they could carry. And the self-sufficient world that Sam's family had built was left scarred and empty. Sam knew that his family needed a fresh start and a new place to rebuild. So, with a heavy heart for what was lost and a flicker of hope for what might be, Sam, his bride, his parents, and all his brothers and sisters loaded up their wagons and their grandpa's copper steel, and they turned their backs on Tiger Valley and set out for a new home 150 miles away on a high, lush valley known as Cove, and there Sam Birchfield was about to become one of the most legendary men in American history. Now, Sam Birchfield was quite the spectacle of a mountain man. He stood 6'4" in his socks with a thick mane of long, cold black hair that he curled and kept as clean as any woman ever aspired to. And look at that beard. Would you? Even the prophets of the Old Testament would have stood in awe at that majestic crop of whiskers that Sam proudly wore on his face. And what a sight he was for anyone who happened to encounter him riding on his Jenny with an old quilt tossed across her back for a saddle and a looped logging chain thrown across that quilt that served as stirrup for his boots. He never left his house without his 5-foot-long flintlock bean rifle that was over 100 years old, laid across his shoulder with a jug of moonshine in his other hand. Now, Sam was the type of man who stood behind his word at all costs. If he looked you in the eye and made you promise while shaking your hand, you best believe he'd go to his grave before he'd ever break that promise. He would go out of his way to help a friend in need, but he was also the type of man who didn't dare cross, because if you did, he wouldn't stop at nothing to settle a score with anyone who cheated him. Well, anyhow, it wasn't long after Sam settled in the Chestnut Flats area of Cade's Cove and lived happily with the 700 souls that called the Mountain Valley home, that soon he became one of the most likable and respected men in the area. Sam built a water mill on his property, which he allowed all his neighbors to use for free of charge. He shared his bear and deer meat with any family that was in need, and he even donated his time helping to build the Primitive Baptist Church. But whenever Sam wasn't doing charitable work, you could find him working the old copper kettle that he had carefully hid on his property. Just like his father and grandfather before him, Sam was highly respected purveyor of stump water, and most folks in the cove appreciated his high-quality product, which they used for medical benefits, as well being consumed by the gallons at every barn dance. That's right, it wasn't long before Sam was pumping out white lightning from his faithful 100-gallon still, where he could haul it by the wagon load down to the general store in Cade's Cove and sell it wholesale to the store owner, who would then distribute it far and wide to those thirsty flatlanders down in Morrisville and Knoxville. And as you might imagine, it didn't take long for those revenuers to begin making trips up to Sam's place looking for his hidden steel. And as for Sam, well, he didn't believe there was any crime in turning corn into liquid. The real crime was getting caught, and for most of the time, the crafty mountaineer was always one step ahead of the law. And each time they tried to catch him, he'd be tipped off and move his steel to a different location. Now, Sam got away with this for decades, and the law, well, they couldn't stop him. He hid his setup so well that many times the posses of lawmen would become lost for days in the mountains, so much that Sam himself would have to go rescue them before they starved to death. However, all that began to change in the 1890s. Several times Sam's operation was raided and he was hauled down to the wagon to the Margarsville jail and booked. His mugshot was from the first arrest, was right there. Now, most of the time he made bail and beat the charges in court, and even became more legendary in his stubborn refusal to indict or name anyone else who was involved in the distribution network. But that all changed in early 1892 when a man named George Powell, who was also involved in the industry of turning liquid corn into currency, snitched on Sam and even led authorities to his steal. Birchfield was promptly arrested, and his time would serve 6 months in the Blount County Jail. Now, Sam would never forget this experience of being locked up in cage like an animal for doing nothing more than exercising his God-given right to make Mountain Dew. Nor would he ever forgive the man who snitched on him. That's right. For the next few years, Sam fumed over his conviction, and it all came to a head on a sunny December day in 1897. And what happens here has remained a mystery to this very day. You see, George Powell came home from a hard day's work where he was greeted by his wife and children in the front yard, and his 3 kids clung to his leg. A single shot rang out from the forest, and George was shot through the shoulder. He ran toward his house and collapsed at his front door, where his wife drug him into the house and locked the door. Too scared to leave the cabin and to go for help, instead she waited until sunrise the next day to summon a doctor. But by then, George Powell was dead. But just who pulled that trigger? Was it Sam Birchfield or another rival of George Powell, or George's? After all, a man who makes a habit of snitching is bound to make a fistful of enemies. George's. After all, a man who makes the habit of snitching is bound to make a fistful of enemies. All right, we're getting to it. He set the wagon tongue of the cove on fire with theories, and it was therefore a packed house. The gunshot rang out. Just like that, Sam's son-in-law, Hale Hughes, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the trial, the prosecution presented evidence that the person who committed the crime left a trail of size 11 boot prints leading away from the cabin. And it just so happened that Hale Hughes also wore a size 11. And with no further evidence, Hale Hughes was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And it seemed for a time that the case was solved in the mind of the folks in Cade's Cove. That was until 2 years later, when Hale Hughes had a change of heart and wrote a letter from prison to the local newspaper, who he shared the details of what he said really happened that fateful day. According to his story, both he and Sam Birchfield were positioned at different vantage points surrounding George's cabin. And he claimed that while he had every intention to shoot George himself, it was actually Sam who pulled the trigger. Just like that, the case was reopened, and Birchfield was arrested for the murder in June of 1899, and despite being a media sensation, the grand jury failed to indict him, and Sam was released. The irony of this entire incident was that during the murder investigation, Sam's photos and life and times as an independent mountaineer and stubborn moonshiner who refused to pay taxes were splashed on the front pages of newspapers all over East Tennessee. And slowly, Sam actually became a folk hero for his brazen ability to outsmart and openly defy the law. And it wasn't just an image, because Sam never stopped with his last arrest for untaxed liquor coming in 1907 when he was at the ripe old age of 67. Finally, the government figured if they couldn't stop him, they might as well hire him, and they did. Literally in 1910 as the World's Appalachian Exposition that was held in Knoxville, Tennessee. The United States government astonishingly gave Sam Birchfield a legal permit to operate his moonshine still out in public for an entire month at the exposition. A staggering 350,000 people came from all over America to watch the old mountaineer do his thing. And he mastered, even a United States federal judge came all the way from Atlanta, and federal revenuers came all the way from Washington, D.C. to marvel at Birchfield's skills. In the winter of 1840, beneath the mountain sky in a Tiger Valley cab, we heard young Sam's cry, played with Cherokee, once hunted, and panthers wandered at will. He learned to read the forest, the ways of wood and hill, granddads, and panthers. Granddad's copper hidden timber by a spring so dark and cold. By 12, he knew the family craft and secrets never told. As long hair with his jugs and his rifle on white lightning flowing, singing freedom song. As an old man, Sam Birchfield was immortalized as one of the greatest men to ever live. The Smoky Mountains best-selling author Horace Cart, in his 1913 epic book titled Our Southern Highlanders, where Sam was mentioned alongside other legends such as Black Bill Walker and Levi Trenholm. I've featured both of their stories here on this channel, and if you like for a treat, we're sure to check them out. As for Sam, well, he eventually turned the moonshine operation over to his sons, who continued pumping out White Lightning Mountain Dew all the way up until the family's property was taken by eminent domain in the 1930s by the federal government to turn their homes into the Smoky Mountains National Park. And as for Sam, well, in his old age, he turned his life over to the Lord before he finally passed away in 1917. Well, I hope y'all enjoyed that story of Sam Birchfield. That really happened, and he lived in the old Cade Cove area right there near the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Hope you enjoyed that story. Like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.